Excellent. So I think that is our cue to get started. Hello and welcome, everyone, to our esteemed guests, to our students, to our alumni, to our faculty, to our friends. I am Dean Angie Cometh of the School of Professional Studies, and we are thrilled tonight to host this important and timely conversation tonight with Dr. Richard Haass and our Associate Dean at the Center for Global Affairs, Carolyn Kissane. The Center for Global Affairs, or CGA, as we say, is approaching its 20th anniversary next year, and it has always prided itself on evolving to help our students understand the opportunities and implications of the most pressing issues of the day. At NYU, we'd like to say that our tradition is the future, and our global networked university gives us such a unique vantage point to teach, to research, and to influence. I'm deeply proud of the Center for Global Affairs and its interdisciplinary approach, its growing faculty, areas of expertise, and new programs in areas like cyber resilience, risk, and security strategies. And its ability to bring conversations like the one we are going to have tonight make it such an important and nimble member of the NYU community. I'd now like to invite up Dr. John Kane to introduce our guest tonight. John is a talented political scientist on our faculty, a prolific writer and researcher focusing on political psychology, public opinion, and experimental research. The topic of the future of democracy is near and dear to his work, and join me in welcoming him to the podium. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. All right. Keep it like this, maybe. Okay. All right. So, greetings, everyone. Welcome. My name is John Kane. It's really nice to see so many familiar faces here. I'm Clinical Associate Professor at NYU Center for Global Affairs. I oversee our specialization in data analytics. And I want to say that it truly is an honor to be introducing our two speakers this evening. In fact, it's more than an honor to do it. I think it really is important to do it. What were once accepted norms in democracies around the world, rules of conduct so well observed as to be taken for granted and even kind of boring, are now contested, and in a way that feels much more than just sort of unfamiliar. I would be remiss if I didn't note that some of my fellow political scientists are currently debating about the extent to which there really is democratic backsliding in the world right now. By objective measures of electoral competitiveness, for example, things look surprisingly, even reassuringly stable. On average, at least compared to some recent decades. That doesn't mean elections are necessarily good around the world. It just means that they are not substantially worse than a decade or so ago, and again, on average. Right, but of course there are other aspects of democracy that we really do care about. Treatment of journalists and media censorship, violations of rights and civil liberties, attempts at undermining democratic institutions, blatantly anti-democratic rhetoric from powerful elites, for example, that might not be so stable. Right? In the US alone, I would say the rhetoric about election fraud over the past several years, you may have heard of this, I'm not sure if you've heard of that, has been game-changing, and I would say that, except that it's not a game. It feels more like the edge of a precipice, the likes of which we living now in this country have yet to know. And so as I cover in my own courses at the CGA and in my research on political psychology in the US, I'm often struck by how easily one can believe total nonsense, so long as they have the motivation to do it. But what really frightens me of late, and I mean this sincerely, is how easily one can justify wrongdoing by their group so long as their leaders tell them it's okay. What we do isn't wrong because the other side is doing it to us. Becomes a justification for anything. This is perhaps how it all looks in the mind of an individual citizen, right? But the picture gets infinitely more complex when thinking about the state of democracy around the globe. Where does it stand? Where is it going? How can countries inspire others to act in the pursuit of democracy even when it's not immediately in their interest to do so? To what extent should countries like the US actively promote democratic values versus just learn to get more comfortable with a non-democratic world, if maybe such a world can offer some semblance of stability, at least in the short term, maybe only in the short term. Right? So with those pressing questions in mind, it's a delight to be able to have with us Dr. Richard Haass, who has a profound understanding of how this all looks from the bird's eye view, from the vantage point of history, and from the clear skies of the pale blue dot that we live on. Haass is known by many for his work at the influential Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, which, among other things, publishes the extremely popular Foreign Affairs magazine. Again, some of you might have heard of it. He has served as the U.S. Special Envoy for Northern Ireland, receiving the State Department's Distinguished Service Award. He has authored numerous books and articles, which not only aim to bring insight to foreign policy making, but also educate citizens to become more informed participants in their country and in global affairs. Haass will be in conversation with Dr. Carolyn Kissane. Dr. Kissane is clinical professor at and divisional dean of the Center for Global Affairs, as well as the founder of the school's Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab. She's a frequent contributor on panels and in news media on topics involving energy, the environment, and geopolitics. But she's not only those things. She also happens to be the former professor to yours truly. Many years ago, before I really understood how important democracy is and what it really means to see it under threat. So with that, I really hope you enjoyed tonight's conversation. Please join me in welcoming Richard Haass and Dr. Carolyn Kissane.
John,
What grade did you give John?
let me see. I'd have to go back. I think it could have been in the A range. Yes, correct. He did go from taking that class, which was kind of an introduction to international relations, to pursuing a PhD in political science, and I guess enjoyed the CGA so much that he decided he was going to come back. Right. So, really thrilled to have John on the faculty, and so. Richard, before I thank you, I just want to thank everyone that's here tonight. So many familiar faces, so many friends of the CGA, so many contributors to the work that we do, faculty, wonderful students, alumni, advisory board members. So thank you all for coming out tonight. I think you're in for a very special treat. We're definitely going to cover a lot of ground. And I also just want to thank Richard. Richard, thank you so very much for joining us this evening. You've had quite a...
I was in the neighborhood. I thought
You were
I'd
in the
stop by.
neighborhood. Okay, well, that's great. We appreciate that you enjoy the West Village. So on the topic of neighborhood, I guess sort of getting comfortable with the title of President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations was not enough, because you recently took on a new position as Senior Counselor of Centerview Partners. So we'll talk a little bit about that, only because you didn't give yourself you didn't really go deep into retirement, right? You decided that maybe you were going to stay in the geopolitics and foreign policy realm. But we're gonna kind of
Let me interrupt you one second. The reason this is not a time for retirement. I mean, think of what's going on in the world. Think of what's going on in this country. If you're not worried, you're not paying attention. So this is a time, rather than going to retirement, I actually think people should be doubling down. This is a time for citizens to try to make a difference. So we'll do retirement later.
Okay, excellent. Well, we're all very happy that you decided not to stay in retirement. So listen, thank you. There you go. You got some claps going on. So let's start. You've written 14 books on foreign policy, 1 on management, and most recently this excellent book, a New York Times bestseller, The Bill of Obligations. But let's go back to 2013. And in 2013, you wrote the book, Foreign Policy Begins at Home, The Case for Putting America's House in Order. And then in 2023, you wrote The Bill of Obligations. So what both sort of go into themes of what is not right on the front here in the United States. So can you kind of connect the dots between what we see happening in today's context of U.S. foreign policy and also sort of the deep polarization that also John touched upon in his opening?
Good to be here with you. And you all, thank you for coming out. think of national security. What got me into both of these books, though there's a big difference between them, is think of national security as a two-sided coin. And one is the stuff of foreign policy, defense policy, what we normally think of as national security policy. But the other side of the coin is what happens here at home. And our ability to function in the world depends upon the ability of our society to function. John was talking about the appeal of democracy. Well, the best thing we can do to promote democracy in the world is show here that it works. If we set an example others respect and might want to emulate, that's more important than any talking points any Secretary of State might have. If we're going to focus on the world, we need the bandwidth to do it. If we are consumed and divided by what's going on here at home, we're not going to have the bandwidth to focus on the world. So there's that. And the reason I wrote the original book, Foreign Policy Begins at Home, about a decade ago, is I was worried we simply weren't meeting our domestic challenges. And by the way, 10 years later, we're still not. And you look at so many things that are not what they could or should be, and it's because, again, all sorts of reasons, but our democracy is not working in many ways. And it has implications for the quality of life, for the economy, you name it. What's different, though, between 10 years ago and now, and the reason I wrote the Bill of Obligations, is 10 years ago I was worried that democracy wasn't working. Now I'm worried that democracy itself is at risk. And that's different. When you get up in the morning, I don't know about you, but you can only worry about so much. I've got limited bandwidth. And so I used to get up in the morning and I'd worry about this or that international problem or maybe some economic problem or social problem here at home, but I didn't worry about American democracy. I sort of assumed that that was okay. Now I worry about it. I no longer take it for granted. Here we are. We're just under 3 years away from the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. That'll happen July 4th, 2026. Do the math. The idea that I don't know what the quality of American democracy is going to be in 3 years. That's something I never imagined. I didn't have the weird imagination to think that that could become our problem. The quality, I thought we'd have problems getting things done, but not democracy itself. So, and again, this not only undermines our ability to be a voice for democracy around the world, and we can talk about how much we should be a voice. I have some concerns about that. But also, it has fundamental consequences for what happens here in the United States. John mentioned that I spent a few years as the U.S. envoy to Northern Ireland at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration. It was one of the hats I wore. And then about, 10 years later, I went back to help the parties in Northern Ireland try to deal with the past, their legacy of violence. I worry that the kind of political violence which characterized Northern Ireland for 3 decades, a period known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland, I don't think it's inconceivable that we couldn't have an American version of it. So I actually worry not only about our dysfunctionality of American democracy, but I actually worry about political violence here. And we have political violence. We saw it on January 6th. We see it on other occasions. We see attempted assassinations or actual assassinations of public officials, threats against them. We see it in the city. So we shouldn't assume it can't happen here. So my principal message is don't be so sanguine that you think you don't have to worry or do stuff. Be worried. But worry is not to make you immobilized. Worry is to galvanize you into action.
Well, thank you for that. I know there are lots of, as I said, students in the audience who are really thinking very hard about the issues that you addressed, and we're going to come back to that. But let's kind of move to U.S.-China relations.
Okay.
Yeah, just kind of keeping it all simple. What do the lessons of history teach us about U.S.-China relations today? And you've been writing a lot about China and what's...
Well, just give me about 1 minute to kind of just set the stage. The modern relationship between the United States and China goes back to the birth of modern China. Chinese had a civil war that was finally ended, or not formally ended, but paused, if you will, in 1949. Communists won. They controlled the mainland. Others who were non-communists went to then called Formosa, now called to Taiwan. U.S.-Chinese relations have gone through 4 phases. in this period over the last roughly 3/4 century. Initially, we went to war with China in Korea. When the United States tried to occupy, after we liberated the South in Korea, we went north by the border. Chinese forces intervened. United States and Chinese forces were shooting at each other and killing each other. Very hostile relationship. That lasted for about 2 decades, the hostility. And then in the end of the 60s, early 70s, American intelligence noticed, gee, this is interesting. China's more worried about the Soviet Union than they are about us. And yet also you had friction, you had skirmishes between Chinese and Soviet forces. And that was the insight of Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon saying, these two are at loggerheads, we can exploit this. And that's just what happened. And that became a major wedge in what became the United States normalized relations with China, first under Kissinger and Nixon, got more formal under Jimmy Carter. And that gave us some leverage against the Soviet Union. That all worked for 2 decades, and then you had the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union. And the rationale for US-Chinese relations became economics. They wanted to grow and develop. We wanted access to the world's largest market, potential market. That worked. And then somewhere along the way, that stopped working. Each side had tremendous recrimination against the others. We said Chinese, as they were, stealing a lot of our intellectual property, frustrated over the trade imbalances. China was becoming, and then we hoped that China, by letting China 10 years ago into the World Trade Organization, China would become more liberal at home, more market-oriented, and more moderate in its foreign policy. We went 0 for 3, kind of like the Yankees. China became more repressive at home, more state-controlled in its economy, and much less moderate in its foreign policy. And we've had a reaction. So right now, U.S.-Chinese relations are in this phase where there's no rationale, there's no foundation. And what the president constantly said, President Biden says, we want to find the floor in U.S.-Chinese relations. And so what, am I supposed to call you Carolyn or Professor Kissane?
You can call me Carolyn, thank you.
Okay, I don't want to offend anybody. So Carolyn asked, what lessons are there from the Cold War? I think there's a few lessons for what we try to do with China now. One is establishing a floor may not seem ambitious, but sometimes in life, that's pretty ambitious. So I would say the most important thing to learn is, and it's a lesson from the Cold War, it's not what you accomplish together, it's what you can jointly work to avoid. So our definition of success might be that. May sound overly modest, trust me, it ain't. There's that. Second of all, we probably have to live with the fact that China isn't a repressive system. Early on in the Cold War, in the 50s, the United States debated and then gave up on the idea of what was called rollback, to do a frontal assault on the Soviet system. Turned out 40 years later, the system died of its own internal inconsistencies and flaws, but that wasn't the goal of American foreign policy. It was a bonus, but not the goal. So part of it is then, I would say, we shouldn't make the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party, the establishment of democracy there, the goal. One is we've got other priorities that I think are more pressing. There's probably also other priorities we have much more influence over rather than that. We ought to think about whether we can establish some rules of the road. When the United States and the Soviet Union tried to make those rules of the road formal, it totally crashed and burned. But however, the United States and the Soviet Union did succeed at having informal rules of the road. Sometimes it's easier in foreign policy to live with arrangements than to sign on to agreements. And that, to me, is one of the lessons of the U.S.-Soviet experience. By the way, 10-second aside, this is exactly what's going on now between the United States and Iran. That the two sides are trying to find some arrangements on sanctions relief and limits on the nuclear program. Neither side wants to sign on to an agreement, because then they would have to defend it for what it is and isn't. Both sides, though, are trying to come up with arrangements they can abide by or live with. Sometimes that is less difficult. Arms control between the United States and the Soviet Union only happened when each side reached a degree of parity or rough equality. I would say the same thing is true with China. No way the Chinese are going to enter into arms control arrangements now, because they see the disparities too great. Lastly, this is the most sensitive area. Sometimes in foreign policy, you have to decide what you confront frontally and what you don't. During the Cold War, the United States showed some sensitivity to the Soviet position in Eastern Europe, and we didn't again do a frontal assault to turn it around. Soviet Union, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, understood some of the limits on what we could do, that they could do in our quote-unquote neighborhood. So what we have to think about with China, how do we manage the biggest difference, obviously Taiwan, and what are the guidelines for managing that?
Can I just interject, though? Because in Foreign Affairs, you did write that the U.S. support for Taiwan must be unambiguous. So how do you reconcile that with sort of finding areas where there can be
I want to slightly correct you, Professor.
Okay, that's okay. I always tell my students they're allowed to challenge me, so you're a guest here. You can challenge me.
What I argued in Foreign Affairs is that we ought to have a position that we would defend Taiwan if it were attacked. It's not that we support Taiwan unconditionally. For example, we should not support Taiwan Declaration of Independence. We should support Taiwan's existence in the context of the so-called One China policy, that we ought not, it's a larger point. Sometimes in foreign policy, or in life, it's often useful to distinguish between problems to be solved and situations to be managed. And I would say Taiwan is at best a situation to be managed. And if we try to solve it, if China tries to solve it, they're going to try to solve it through war. And I believe, the reason I want us to say we would defend Taiwan is I want to deter China from doing just that. I want them to understand the costs they will pay if they use force against Taiwan. But I also don't want Taiwan to do something that triggers a crisis, and we ought to leave open the so-called final status of where this goes. If we have finessed this for 40 years, it's quite brilliant. If you look at what's happened, how the United States and China have managed or finessed the Taiwan issue for 40 years, it's quite an impressive piece of diplomacy. The question is whether we can continue doing this, and I think in particular there's pressure on our side to change things, a little bit on Taiwan's, mostly on the mainland. And there's a school of thought that China, the mainland, is not prepared to see this situation drift, that they essentially want to turn it from something to be managed into something to be solved. And my guess is if they were to do that, I'm not predicting they will, but if they were to do it, I would think, could not live with that. And that is the basis for conflict that would fundamentally change the direction of the 21st century, and not in a good way.
All right, so we're staying on easy topics. I'm going to move to Ukraine, and in April of this year, you and Charles Kupchan.
This is kind of unfair when someone actually reads what you write and then quotes it to you. This is really unfair.
So I'll keep it. I'll simplify it. Other than you kind of the two of you made a case that the West needs a new. Kind of a new strategy in Ukraine, and now we're getting to it's the middle of September. The counteroffensive has been going on. It looks like Ukraine is having some small wins, but what does this situation look like moving forward? Can you envision, based on your decades of experience in foreign policy, can you imagine a kind of a settlement, a peaceful end to this, or is this going to be a grinding conflict that goes on?
Lots embedded in there. So
Take
here
what you
we
want out
are.
of it.
We're just over a year and a half into the war. We're basically maybe 2/3 plus or minus through the latest fighting season, about 100 days into the so-called counteroffensive, just to situate it. So if we had this gathering in February of last year, the idea that the map would look like it does today, we would say fantastic. Because virtually no one would have predicted that Russia would perform so badly and Ukraine would perform so well. And tremendous credit to the people, the leadership, the armed forces of Ukraine. Obviously, they've been helped by the United States, Europe, and others. So here we are. But now, Ukraine has defined success as liberating all of its territory, going back to what was the 1991 borders when it became an independent country. I understand that. Foreign policy, international relations, there aren't a lot of rules. The most fundamental, though, of rules, the closest we have to a universal rule or norm, is that sovereignty ought to be respected, territory ought not to be acquired by force. It is, by the way, the reason the world, led by the United States, reversed Saddam Hussein's aggression against Kuwait in 1990 and 1991. And the problem right now is that I'm not sure at all that Ukraine has the means to do this, even if it were to get additional military help from the United States, which Charlie and I argued for in the piece. Russia's getting additional military help from North Korea, as you've noticed. It's producing a lot of stuff on its own. Its forces are very dug in. So I think this is going to be hard. And what I want to avoid is a situation where the war goes on indefinitely. I want to avoid a situation where, in the name of saving Ukraine, it gets destroyed. So what I'm thinking of, what in that article and subsequently, is if Ukraine can't liberate its lands, and I'm skeptical. I'd love to be proven wrong. We'll see. Is there something you could accept as an interim arrangement? And what we've put out as ideas of a ceasefire as an interim arrangement. It would be coupled with security guarantees and so forth, and you don't give up on the goal of Ukraine ultimately getting all of its territory back. It just wouldn't be pursued through military means, which I don't think, again, it's not obvious to me will be realistic, but ultimately, and it may have to wait for a post-Putin leadership or a post-Putin leadership. And you'd have to do it through diplomacy and economic sanctions and incentives and so forth. So my goal is Ukraine ultimately going back to its 1991 borders. There may have to be some provisions for a degree of cultural autonomy for ethnic Russians living inside of Ukraine. Indeed, I think Ukraine would be smart to put some of that on the table. I don't think the situation is ripe for this now. Ukraine is not prepared to back off its goal of military liberation. Russia feels no incentive to compromise at all because they're persuaded that if they just hold on long enough, either a new president will come into office here whose enthusiasm for supporting Ukraine is, shall we say, limited, or that Europe may get tired or whatever. So neither side is disposed to compromise right now. So I don't think it's a great moment for diplomacy. But at some point, I would like to put some ideas out there, in part, not because they're even accepted. Sometimes you put ideas forward, just to be clear, not because they're accepted, but they shape the conversation. I want Russia to have to explain why a ceasefire isn't good enough. And what I'm hoping is if they were to reject it, I think it makes it less difficult for us to sustain support for Ukraine. So I'm thinking about how to do this in a way that we can manage support for Ukraine, yet keep open a possibility of stopping the war. At the same time, we very much keep open the goal of Ukraine acquiring its rightful territory. This is complicated. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. This war is extraordinarily expensive to the people of Ukraine, to Europe, to the world, to Russia and others. And if it were to continue for years, I worry about that. I also worry about a change in politics here and elsewhere. I don't want, essentially, I don't want Putin to be proven right. The time is on his side. I want him to understand the time is not on his side. And only if he were to understand that do I think there's any chance of getting to this point.
But isn't there a risk, though, of sort of waiting for the United States, sort of not pushing a little bit at this point, given the fact that we are looking at, 2024, a presidential election that could...
It's one of the reasons I want to put a proposal out there, because if the Russians reject it, as I think they will, I think it makes it a little bit less difficult for us to sustain aid to Ukraine. But this is a tricky piece of diplomacy, and I've already been vilified, attacked, and so forth for suggesting such things. But again, my goals are not different than others. But you have to think about foreign policy in terms of tools. There's military tools, there's intelligence tools, there's diplomatic tools, there's sanctions, economic tools. So I know where I want to get to. I'm just not persuaded we can get to where we want in a reasonable amount of time at a reasonable cost using essentially only the military tool. If we could, fair enough. But I'm skeptical of that. And if it turns out that I'm right, then you have to say, okay, well, if 2 fighting seasons aren't enough, well, will 3 be enough? Will 4 be enough? Will 5 be enough? So you'd have to persuade yourself that the trajectory was one that you would get where you want to get soon enough and at a cost you were prepared to pay. I am unpersuaded of that argument. And so that's why I'm not saying I have something necessarily better, and it takes both sides to, it takes one side to start a war, in this case Russia. It takes multiple sides, two sides to stop one, much more complicated. But I would at least I'd want to explore it. It might work, and even if it didn't work, I think it would expose policies in a way that could help us manage the situation going forward.
Okay, so the topic of tonight's event, as well as kind of the series that the CGA is launching, is the future of democracy. And as John has pointed out, who's now going to run to class to teach, so John, thank you. And as you've very much sort of dug into in your work and your career, is there's so many different countries where democracy is under severe threat. One of those countries is Israel, which we've seen, definitely over the last year, where it's been quite a disintegration of democratic norms and kind of a real sort of chipping away at the institutional capacity. So when you sort of look at Israel and you see what's happening now, is it a direction that can be turned? Someone I spoke to this morning who is from Tel Aviv, he didn't believe that there's a kind of a turnaround. He actually talked about even two Israels, which is this idea that Tel Aviv would succeed. Maybe that is very far-fetched, but nonetheless, I think there's a real feeling inside of Israel that it's a very divided country.
Well, Israel is a divided country.
Well, it is a divided country.
And there's different fault lines. And the one that's preoccupied most Americans for years was the fault line between either Israelis and Arab states, or Israelis and Palestinians. And the Israeli-Arab fault line has largely, though not entirely, been managed. The Egyptian peace treaty, the Jordan peace treaty, the Abraham Accords, and so forth. So that's no longer the dominant fault line. Israeli-Palestinian fault line very much still there, 30 years after Oslo. We can talk about it if you want. Until about a year or two ago, the principal division, and it's still there, you got divisions within Israeli society between secular Israelis and ultra-Orthodox Israelis, and also between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, non-Jews. And so, and what's happened now is, this very, what do you call it, conservative right wing. I don't call it conservative because it's too radical. Conservatives have respect for institutions and precedent. So I would not call this a conservative government. Very careful about the word conservative. This is a radical Israeli coalition and government. And what they are essentially looking to do, it's a country without a constitution that's having a constitutional crisis. And what they want to do is shift the balance of authority or power away from the Supreme Court of Israel and towards the Knesset, towards the Israeli parliament. And ironically now you have a fascinating situation where the Supreme Court of Israel is considering a case about whether it has overstepped its bounds. Quite interesting to ask the court itself whether it should have the ability to declare what the parliament passes as reasonable or unreasonable. I don't know how it's going to play. You can also see what's going on as a pretty impressive demonstration of democracy. The fact that so many people are willing to come out day after day after day to vote with their feet, to vote with their voice, really impressive. I'm mildly pessimistic, though, and the reason is for demographic reasons. If I look at modern Israel, I lived there for a year. I was President Bush the father's Middle East advisor for 4 years. So I've spent a lot of my career working on it. I've visited more times than I can count. But if demographic trends are really interesting, and you got a lot of students in the room, one thing I would urge some of you to think about is focusing a bit on demographics. Anything, lots of things you're going to look at in foreign policy or international relations can change in a New York minute. Demographics can't. Demographics are like the slowest super tanker. And you can look where things are, and you know where things are going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and so forth, because it's the way generations change, and whether it's the size of a population, gender mixes, aging, what have you. You have a pretty good idea. So in Israel, you see the ultra-Orthodox are large and growing at a much faster rate given family size, and secular. You had the influx of Russian Jews, many of whom are quite conservative, and so forth. So you have Jews from the Middle East, many of whom have immigrated from the Middle East, many of whom are more conservative than those who originally came from Europe. Anyhow, the political complexion of Israel, I think, is moving in a more nationalistic direction, and I think this raises questions about the nature of Israeli democracy, getting to your point, Carolyn, and I think it also has real implications for the other fault line, the Israeli-Palestinian fault line.
And what about the region? So, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian fault line, but you had some movements with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with
Right.
Jordan. So what does that look like in terms of further destabilization in the region?
It's an interesting question. One of the things going on now is there's a three-way conversation going on among the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. And basically, each side is motivated by different things. Saudis want a security guarantee from the United States against Iran, and they want to have a nuclear program of their own with a considerable degree of autonomy over it. So that's what the Saudis want. The Israelis want normalization with Saudi Arabia. They want political normalization. Basically, they want the Saudis to join the Abraham Accords. And that would be an enormous accomplishment. Saudi Arabia has a special place in the Arab world and the Islamic world. The leader of Saudi Arabia, the custodian of the two holy mosques, and so forth. The administration has a third agenda. Neither one of that, it would be fine with Israeli-Saudi normalization. It's debating the terms of a security guarantee, the terms of a nuclear program. And the Saudis saying, make it more common, they would only agree to all this if it were in treaty form, so it couldn't be reversed by some future administration. Well, in order to get Congress or the Senate, more specifically, to approve it, you would have to have a major element for the Palestinians. So the Israelis, needless to say, didn't want this. The Saudis were not insisting on it at all. But this is something the administration is insisting on, because we've had a long-term goal in this administration of brokering peace or progress between Israelis and Palestinians, and there's no way you could get the Democratic Party and the Senate people there to support it otherwise. And the question is, can you come up with something that is, Saudis kind of, for them it's not a party, the question is, can you come up with something that's enough for the Palestinians and not too much for the Israelis and enough for the United States? I'm not sure. I'm not sure this circle could be squared. And even without this, I think there's a really interesting question. If relations between Israelis and Palestinians, both in Gaza, but even more in the West Bank, deteriorate further, whether the Abraham Accords would be able to be insulated or protected from the repercussions or fallout of that. And I think the jury's out a little bit on that. So it's combustible, as it was. But for those of you who are foreign policy types in the room, what's so interesting is this issue and the larger issues of the Middle East. We just marked 9/11. We've had two major wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And what's so interesting is that after 20 years of unprecedented American focus on this part of the world, we're now focusing on Europe, and we're focusing on what's called the Indo-Pacific, on Russia, on China above all. And what we're trying to do is dial down, we the United States, our involvement in this part of the world. But we're obviously worried about everything you've just raised, as well as the Iranian nuclear program, and that's why foreign policy is hard and interesting.
It definitely is. I can tell from looking out at the audience that everyone is sort of you're raising lots of questions and thoughts. So you started after you left the council, you started a weekly newsletter, Home and Away. And
Which you can all subscribe to. And
I was going to go there.
You can afford to subscribe. There's a special student rate, which is it's free. There's also a special non-student rate. It's free. So you have no excuse. If I don't see the numbers, the new one comes out Friday. If I don't see the numbers jump up, I'll be really hurt.
So what's been really great to read in your weekly newsletter is you've been covering a lot of topics that are very interesting to the CGA. You've been taking on climate security. You've been taking on sort of what needs to happen around climate change and addressing climate change, AI, cybersecurity, and so much more. So since I know there are a lot of my students here who have studied with me, so We have a big event coming up at the in November, the Conference of Parties number 28, which to address climate change, and the most recent report clearly indicates that we're not making progress. So, do you have confidence in these types of very large sort of events that bring together, countries and NGOs and the whole like? I mean, do you see that there's, after, this will be the 28th time? I'm just sort of curious to get your take as a...
So this reminds me of an old Russian joke, Soviet joke, when the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, Leonid Brezhnev, was at a press conference. He was asked a question by a quote-unquote Soviet journalist. And the journalist said, Comrade General Secretary, in a word, can you tell us how is our economy? And Brezhnev went, good. And he said, Comrade General Secretary, I'm a working journalist. I need a little bit more than that to write a story. Could you say a little bit more? He said, not good.
So one Russian joke to another Russian joke. What is a pessimist? And some of the students who have studied under me, what is a pessimist? A well-informed optimist.
There we go. Yes.
There you go. So
That's not very
go
funny, though. So you asked me in a word. Well, COP28, this meeting in the United Arab Emirates, I think it starts right around the end of November.
Correct.
And runs for the first 2 weeks or so of December. Will it accomplish much of anything? No.
Okay.
It will be about as successful as COPs 1 through 27. If I were right about it, the headline would be "Cop Out." It's
there might be some students who might take that up as
I have precious little faith that diplomacy will do much here, and the reason is that national requirements, as seen by governments, take precedence. So, I mean, the last year, like, this is your expertise, you should be telling us, but look at the amount of coal being burned in the world. So we can have all these conferences, but in the meantime, countries are worried about unemployment. They're worried about economic growth. And climate change, the danger is structurally two problems getting the world to do anything better. One is people always think about it or thought about it as something out there then down the road. Hey, it's now. But I think in too many minds, it's still slightly futuristic. And the other is it's the dilemma or whatever of collective action. Everyone's waiting for everybody else to deal with it. So then a lot of countries say, well, look, we're only a small part of it. So even if we do the right thing, it really won't matter. So why should we bother doing the right thing? We'll let those who made the problem what it is, or the big economies. And so I just don't have faith in global diplomacy on this. The problem, as you say, it's getting worse. Not only aren't we making progress, we're losing ground. I think the only hope is largely from the world of technology, that there will be breakthroughs. And we're seeing, the report that came out the other day about, I thought it was nutty about certain things on fossil fuels, but I thought it's good about the pace at which new technologies, solar, whatever, are being introduced. I think there's more that can be done with wind, with nuclear, whatever. But I think, again, this is your expertise much more than. But I think if there's hope, it's going to be technology. And there's an interesting parallel to this, and it's called COVID-19. So COVID-19 hits. What got us through COVID-19? So let me suggest two technologies were critical. One's the obvious one, mRNA vaccines. I don't know if you remember, when COVID-19 first hit, people had said it takes between 5 to 10 years to develop a vaccine, which was true, but those were traditional vaccines. This was a whole new type of vaccine, a whole new developmental path. So what would have taken 10 years took less than a year, plus phenomenally successful, phenomenally safe. The other technology got us through COVID, anybody have an idea? Zoom, excellent. Zoom meant that we didn't have to make a choice every day. Do we go to school or go to work and endanger our health? Because of Zoom, we could stay healthy, stay in our bubbles, yet still effectively lead our lives. And I think, so we could argue or debate, or not argue, but imagine what might be the technologies with climate. And again, I would defer to you, Carolyn. what could happen with batteries, or what could happen with alternatives, what could happen with carbon capture. We can go down the list, and maybe it's all of the above, but that much more than governmental action. So I'm actually, one of the reasons I've decided to move a little bit into the private sector is I'm excited about what companies are going to do. I actually think, because again, governments have a role, and Operation Warp Speed and all that, government support and all that for the private sector, help with mRNA vaccines. But in things like climate, in a lot of these global challenges, I think if there's answers, they're more likely to come out of the corporate world, out of laboratories, than they are out of governments, out of diplomacy. Governments can accelerate what happens in the labs, but I don't think diplomacy is going to be the answer.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We're going to sort of shift gears a little bit, and we're just please, if you have questions, I'm going to ask Richard a few kind of questions about the mentor that has had the most impact on you. If you have a book that you recommend that the audience, definitely something that has influenced you, and also get a take, because we have, again, many students in the room. What advice do you have for students who are interested in working in the foreign policy, global affairs space? But first, can you sort of share with us kind of a quick take on a mentor that had an impact, and why?
I had a few. I was lucky. The first was a professor of religion. I was a student at Oberlin, and got me interested in religion, and that got me to the Middle East, and that got me into Middle Eastern studies, and it never occurred to me it was going to happen. So great teachers can open doors intellectually and in terms of your life. So I was lucky. Had a great teacher, Tom Frank. In government, my greatest mentor was a gentleman named Brent Scowcroft, who was the American National Security Advisor, not once but twice, first for Gerald Ford, then for George Herbert Walker Bush, 41. Best boss I ever had, better at that job than anybody before or since. It's a job that required you to be both a counselor to the president, but also someone who would make sure the system worked, and he got the balance exquisitely right. So those are probably my, any number of others. People can mentor in lots of ways by the books they write. Teaching, I taught a course at Harvard, which gets a little bit at a book I'm going to mention, with a guy named Dick Neustadt, Richard Neustadt, who wrote a book called Presidential Power. But he wrote a book with Ernest May, who also taught, and Ernest took a sabbatical, so I was brought in as a young professor to teach the course with Professor Neustadt. Best experience I ever had teaching in my life. And they wrote a book called Thinking in Time. And if there's one book I could recommend that you look at, it's how to, and the subtitle is something like The Use of History for Decision Makers. What it does is it's about applied history. And it teaches you how to use history and avoid abusing history to make sense of the present. And it's a really, really valuable tool for those of you who are thinking not just about foreign policy, it could be about domestic policy or anything else. And then they have a lot of recommended approaches or almost techniques about how to go about the use of history. It's not a cookbook. It doesn't give you a recipe for things, but it gives you guidance, and it gives you some first order approximation. So if there was a single book I'd recommend that had a lot of impact on me, it would be that one.
Excellent. And any other sort of words of wisdom that you'd like to sort of share with our the young people in our audience, or everyone in our audience?
Well, I was once a young person. So look, I'll give you this. So there's no inconsistency. It's the same advice I give. I've got two kids, 30-ish, both working in the political world, which is interesting. Look, the main thing is to try things, expose yourself to things. I think too many young people, and I've noticed this when I taught, I've noticed that the council worry too much about getting it right from the get-go. Nobody gets it right from the get-go. Think of your 20s or early 30s, divide it into 2-year chunks and say, I'm going to give myself 5 experiences or a half dozen experiences. From each one of those, I'll learn something. And I might learn what's not right for me. But that's cool. And hopefully by the end of it, you'll have a half dozen experiences under your belt. You'll have grown, you'll have learned in each one. You'll pick up better tools, better skills, and you'll have a better sense of what might be right for you, what you're best at or most interested in. But don't put pressure on yourself to get it right the first time around. Just get going. Start doing stuff, and always your goal should be, particularly when you're young, you got the luxury to learn a lot. People aren't expecting you to make enormous contributions. Most Nobel Prizes for peace don't go to 22-year-olds, so don't worry about it. Go there, tool up, invest in yourself, and think about it, your 20s or early 30s. Here you are, going to school is an investment in yourself. Follow on, you continue. And then as you go through life, hopefully the balance turns. You never stop investing in yourself and learning, but you start giving back and contributing more. But at the front end, you be a little bit selfish. Load up, get involved, and not, it can be in the classroom. I'm a great believer in this book that Carolyn waved around before, public service of various types, which is, I think, fantastic. Find different, it can be domestic, it can be international, but ways of getting involved. You can give something back, but also tool up, learn about yourself, learn about other people, get out a little bit of your bubble that all of us find ourselves in. I could go on, but that's a start.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will, and please introduce yourself. So Bob, you get first question. Yes, we have a mic coming around. Tano's coming around.
Richard, thanks so much for your insights. It's really helpful to all of us, and I think to the world generally. Turning to democracy and the dangers that we're facing. We've spent a lot of time tonight talking about the dangers and the problems with democracy.
Sure.
And I think you've pointed out that one of the keys to solving the democratic issues in the world is the American democracy.
Mhm.
Because if we're strong, that'll hopefully be a good example for other countries. What can we do in the United States to turn things around?
Thank you for asking that. This was not a plant, but happy to have it. Okay, so can I take 2 or 3 minutes?
You can, of course. I think that's actually really good because it also addresses many of the points in your book.
Yeah, so one is to rethink it, which is we think about democracy, and if we had word association, we think about things like rights and freedoms, and those are all central. Think about the American political experience, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Constitution only got ratified because of those. That was part of the deal. Several states said no Bill of Rights, no Constitution ratification. My view is that rights are essential, but they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. And that democracy only works. I remember before I talked about the coin with 2 sides, national security, the world, and domestic. Well, the democracy coin has 2 sides. There's rights, but the other side of the coin is obligations. And we have to think about what we as individuals, not just what the government or the society owes us, but what we owe one another, what every person in this room owes one another, and what every person in the room owes the country. And so I think we need to rebalance our approach to democracy. It's worth doing, because I actually think that democracy has many advantages. It's delivered for all of the flaws in this country. I would think it's been an extraordinary, modern American democracy has been extraordinarily successful. And by the way, one of the things that's good about democracy, it has the capacity to correct its flaws. And unlike much more brittle systems. And what I talk about in the book is 10 obligations. Because if American democracy is going to be saved, it's not going to be delivered from above. It's going to be saved by people such as ourselves. And it's going to be people getting informed, people getting involved, having some openness to compromise, avoiding violence when we disagree. I talked about public service. I've already bent the ear of your dean about requiring civics education. I don't believe anyone should leave any campus, any high school or college campus, without having a grounding in civics. We wouldn't let somebody leave and get a diploma if they couldn't read or count or figure out how to turn on a computer. Why is being a citizen in a democracy any less important? So I think that ought to be essential. I think we need a mentality of where people, almost in the spirit of John F. Kennedy, put country before party or personal matters, and it's up to us, citizens, voters, to hold them to that and to get involved. I thought it was quite stunning that about a year ago we had a midterm election, one of the most critical in the country's history, and over half of the eligible voters didn't vote. 55% of eligible voters didn't vote. We're going to have, arguably in 14 months, the most critical presidential election in modern history. So will only traditionally about 60-odd% of Americans, of eligible Americans vote. Well, what about the other 35, 40%? And tiny numbers, if we look at recent elections, given the Electoral College, tiny numbers in a couple of states, often a total of less than 100,000 votes, can change the outcome of the election, have enormous outcomes. So yeah, so people have the obligation to get informed, to get involved, to, again, but do it in a civil manner. I think it's really important that campuses be places here. I mean, this is also something to be practiced here, where, we talked before, John talked about, democratic backsliding. We can't afford democratic backsliding around the world. We can't afford it on campuses. There's got to be a culture of tolerance and liberalness, of obligations as well as rights. So I think it can start here, and I think it can carry on the rest of your lives. But yeah, I think there's lots that individuals can do. I also talk about what businesses can do, what the people who give sermons on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays can do, about talking about civility and non-violence. Businesses can make it easy for their employees to vote. Parents have obligations. Ronald Reagan said the most important room in the house is the dining room. That's where parents should come together with their kids to talk about issues, and again, obligations as well as rights. So there's distributed responsibility here. If American democracy is going to do well, again, it's not going to happen from above. It's going to happen, the cumulative effect of what enough citizens do. And I'm worried, but I'm optimistic. Worried enough to write the book, but optimistic because I still think that there's, as I go around the country talking about the book, people get it. They know there's something wrong. It's resonating a bit, not because my prose is so good, but I think people know there's something wrong. And they know that democracy is valuable, and they know that before it goes any more off the rails, people in this country have to act to protect it and preserve it.
Thank you for that. Chloe Domrovsky, who is the CGA's inaugural executive in residence. Chloe, go ahead.
Good to see you, Chloe.
Always good to see you, Richard. So you mentioned that you don't have hope that diplomacy can solve the climate crisis, and you have more hope for the private sector. Another pernicious problem for democracy is the inequality that we see globally, those people for whom globalization has maybe left them out within their country. How does that problem, it's not a problem that can be solved. How does that situation get managed in a way that protects our institutions and democracy?
You are so not going to like my answer.
That's a setup. Okay, go ahead.
So let me just make that the predicate. I don't think inequality per se is a problem. I knew you wouldn't like my answer. There always has been inequality, always will be. What matters in this country, I'll use America and then I'll go global. There's always been inequality. I mean, now we have the Bezoses and the whoever else's, Bill Gates, and we had the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers. So there's always been inequality. What there was, though, was a real opportunity for people who are not born with wealth to get ahead. So the whole idea of the American dream, Horatio Alger, work hard, study hard, whatever, play by the rules, you could get ahead. It was pretty true. Now, there were barriers that were against it. Racial discrimination, gender discrimination, I get that. But over time, a lot of those have been reduced. But public education was something that was really precious in the sense we had a lot of mobility. I worry now that we don't have it. So what worries me is not that there's inequality, that the rich are rich. What worries me is a lot of people who aren't rich don't have a real opportunity to get less poor. And more than anything, I worry about the quality of public education, public schools in this country, which I think is the biggest single national problem we have, or challenge we have. Because traditionally, public education's been the latter. And if we don't have social and economic mobility in this country, then we develop a rigid class system, then we have a real problem. Then we have the potential, I think, for serious social violence. Plus, we don't tap the talents of so many of our citizens. We underachieve. So again, my goal is not to eliminate inequality or even necessarily to reduce it, though I think there's some extreme forms of wealth that, whatever. What my goal is to see that opportunity is real in this country. And that's why I'm glad, by the way, there's some of the movement against legacy admissions. I don't know what NYU does, but I'm not a fan of legacy admissions. I don't think people should be advantaged by anything other than individual merit. I have, for someone who was a Republican for 40 years, I believe that inheritance taxes should be pretty severe. I don't think people should be able to pass on massive amounts of wealth. It's not fair that certain people are born on third base and think they hit a triple. I think that, and then anti-discrimination stuff ought to be enforced. And again, but if I could choose one single thing, it would be to make public education. Think about it. People line up around the world at American consulates to come to schools like this one. Not a lot of people line up at American consulates around the world to go to inner city public schools. That ought to be our goal. That they line up, not just to come to NYU or the Ivies or whatever, but they line up to go to public schools. And we're not there. We're not even close. We are not even. So that to me is a big flaw. Around the world, yeah, you're right. There is tremendous inequality in some cases because of, perhaps resources and the rest, but a lot of it's because of governance. I actually think the biggest differentiator in performance in countries is governance. Things like education, things like corruption, things like the quality of leadership, the role of markets, freedom. It's very hard to have a successful economy if you don't have a degree of freedom. China, by the way, is finding that out. Very hard to sustain significant levels of economic growth if you repress the private sector. Very hard to have the benefits of a private sector without having one. Just saying. So if there's a single problem, we spend a lot of time in the business of foreign policy and international relations talking about great powers and strong states. I actually think one of the most interesting things to study is weak states, and particularly internally. In the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and so forth, quite prevalent. And that to me, so rather than focusing on evening out equality and inequality type things, it's how do we help countries deal with their internal governance challenges. If we can do that, or if they're willing to help themselves, then I think they'll perform just fine. But that's tough. That's the single toughest thing I know how to do in international relations, is to help countries improve their governance. Because it's just, and we've learned it the hard way in many cases. If you look at what happened recently in Afghanistan and other places, tough. We've had some minor successes, things like Colombia was some extent. You look at places like South Korea over the years, I think tremendous success, some elements of post-World War II policy, but it's very tough, very, very tough to try to be that intimately involved in another country to help them work through these issues. But that actually, more than anything else, it's not really, I don't see it as an international problem for the most part. And yes, there's more the international financial institutions can do. I get it. And I hope Larry Summers is successful in his new mandate and so forth. But the biggest thing I think is internal, and that's a tough foreign policy challenge.
Okay, we're going to take, yes, Gabrielle, right here.
Hi, thank you once again for coming over to speak with us here. I was curious.
Can you raise your voice?
Hi.
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you once again for coming over here to speak with us. I was curious, you mentioned earlier about, the recent developments with Kim Jong-un and Putin meeting.
Yep.
I was wondering, using that as an example, and also recent changes in the world, whether that be BRICS expanding or more countries in Africa aligning with Russia and China. I mean, where do you see the state of global affairs in 10 years from now? Will we be living in a multipolar world, or are we already there?
Well, we're already there, but that doesn't quite capture it. Traditionally, when political scientists or IR types use phrase like multipolar, they were talking about a configuration where, say, 3, 4, 5, 6 major countries dominated the world. I don't think that captures where we are or where we're heading. think it's one of my previous books had the title, I think it was 3 books ago, A World in Disarray. I think that's much closer to it, where you have, in part, you have a number of major powers, United States, China, Russia, India, whatever, Japan. A lot of middle powers. We talk a lot about North Korea and Iran, but a lot of others that are more benign. A lot of other countries, gets back to the previous conversation about many of whom are weak. You've got global phenomena, getting back to what Carolyn was asking about on climate, where there's an enormous gap between global challenges and collective responses. I mean, one of the, we always use the phrase international community. I hate to burst your bubble, anybody in this room, but there isn't one. There isn't one. And I don't see one coming together. So my guess is, and then you got 2 other problems. You got the introduction of a lot of new technologies, which are going to be really hard to regulate or manage, including AI, potentially biotech. We haven't done so well with cyber. And then the question is, what's going to happen here? The United States has been the principal, we haven't done it unilaterally, but we have taken the lead in many cases over the last 75 years in building order in the world. Well, what if we're preoccupied here at home or divided here at home? Ain't nobody else to do it. It's not a queue of others. So my guess is the trajectory of the world is not a positive one. And that we're seeing a little bit, we're seeing both violence within countries, pretty prevalent. We now see what happened with Russia. One of the reasons it's so important Russia not succeed is we don't want to set the precedent that this is somehow a smart choice for others to make. We have potential for proliferation in both Asia and the Middle East. We'll see what happens with Iran. We'll see what happens with North Korea, what happens there. And we already talked about climate. 20 million people worldwide died during COVID. So I think all things being equal, the trajectory right now is way beyond the multipolar world. It's a messier world. It won't be uniform. There'll be pockets of some good things and so forth. But all things being equal, how do I put it? When we just come out of, if you look at the last 75 years, we had 4 decades of Cold War that stayed cold, didn't have great power conflict, ended on terms that quite congenial to Western values and interests. Last 3 decades, a different set of challenges and responses. But all things being equal, I think the next, if I had to guess, 7 decades, the rest of the century, I think it's a rougher trajectory. I think looking through the windshield as opposed to the rearview mirror, I worry. Not inevitable. Nothing's inevitable. We'll see what new technologies do on climate, on disease, whether we can get the best out of the AIs and the rest rather than the worst, see whether the United States can get on top of its internal challenges on democracy. Russia gets frustrated, who knows? I mean, I think it's quite conceivable that in 20 years you could have a very different Russia or China. I don't think it's inconceivable to imagine that in both countries there will be rethinking about the directions that the current leadership has taken those countries. That's happened before in both Russian and Chinese history. Would not be shocked if it were to happen again. So I don't mean to paint a bleak future.
Well, you kind of have, but okay. just so you know, kind of have.
But I do. But so I can make a much more. I can paint what a positive future, but then there'd be a lot of preconditions that would have to be met. And all I'm saying is it's not obvious to me they're going to be met. So it's all things being equal. It's easier to see a more problematic future. That's the one we've been on if you think about the last few decades. But it's not. There's nothing inevitable about anything. That's if there's one takeaway I'd leave you all with, nothing's inevitable. There's nothing about history that's baked into the cake. There's certain trends that are there. There's certain probabilities, but ultimately it depends what individuals with capacity and power do. And so I'm not here in the. When I ran the policy planning staff at the State Department, I used to say my job was policy planning, not policy predicting. I'm not smart enough to predict the future, but I can see, I can see various trends, and I'm concerned. But I can also see how they could be managed. And so, and again, it's why it's so interesting. It's why I want the best and the brightest not to go to Goldman Sachs. I want the best and the brightest to do this. I want the best and the brightest to go into public policy, to work on foreign policy and domestic issues. So hold off going to Goldman Sachs.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to, Professor Jennifer Trahan, who leads our international law and human rights concentration. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thanks for this really rich discussion. So we talked a little bit before. So I've been working with some of the states at the UN to try to create a special tribunal on the crime of aggression to get Vladimir Putin prosecuted for the crime.
Is it on?
Should I start again?
You might want to face everybody else. That way
Okay.
they can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. So I've been working with states at the UN to try to create a special tribunal on the crime of aggression to get President Putin and other Russian leaders prosecuted for this crime, as we did at Nuremberg. And in our quick discussion, you said, not now. So, but in years ago, when I used to be counsel at Human Rights Watch and tried to work on accountability for Afghanistan, which went absolutely nowhere, the UN's position was, well, we need peace first. Accountability will come years later. And then we saw how we got neither peace nor accountability. So at least, so I'm a lawyer, not a political scientist, but at least in the field, we've kind of said two approaches: peace and accountability, and you don't negotiate one away. And you also mentioned the challenge of deterring China, and I think one of our challenges, if we don't go after this now, is that a lack of deterrence towards China. So I kind of feel that China is watching what we do in regard to this. So I just wanted to push a little.
The latter, I don't buy at all. The principal priority for this Chinese leadership is the preservation of the Communist Party of China and their rule. And they're going to do what they believe they have to do to sustain it. They're not, that to me is pretty straightforward. In terms of Mr. Putin, I think right now we should be collecting evidence about war crimes. But do I think we ought to be charging him with them? No, it's not my priority right now. We may have to negotiate with Putin, as distasteful as that is. Right now, he represents authority in Russia. I don't like it, but it's a fact of life. So why do we want to create barriers to working with him? Why do we want to create disincentives for him? If he believes that there's no reason for him to stop prosecuting this war because he's going to be hauled off to a 21st century Nuremberg, what good is that? So I just think in foreign policy, you want to leave people with certain types of alternatives and choices. I do not want to leave Mr. Putin in a position where he believes the only choice is escalation or prosecution of war. So I would say collect all the evidence, but give yourself some flexibility, because the priority right now is not ending the war no matter what, but it's ending the war on terms that preserve Ukraine's viability and its long-term ability to recover its territory. If we can do all that, and then we can pursue war crimes against a few, and even that's going to have to be looked at. I went through this in Iraq and other places. Imagine if a situation where you have a struggle for power in Russia. We may want flexibility on this, because we may want a lot of people in Russia to feel they are not tarred with the brush of what happened in Ukraine. We may want people to say, hey, we might want to limit war crimes to very, 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 very few people, because it might be the military or security forces who are in a position to influence the future trajectory of Russia. So this, to me, it's not an absolute. My problem with many people, I don't know you, my problem with many people in the human rights world, it's too much of an absolute. For me, it is a factor to factor into other things. Right now, it's not my priority. My priority is Ukraine's viability, and I want to stop the war. And Mr. Putin's legal fate is down the list, to be honest. What's most important right now is that the international principle that territory cannot be acquired through the use of force, that be upheld. That, to me, is far, far, far more important than Mr. Putin's legal fate. One man's opinion.
Well, thank you for that opinion. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. a fantastic conversation. We are deeply grateful for
Thank
the
you all.
opportunity.
Thank you.
And we do hope that everyone here is going to join us. We're going to be hosting a reception outside. Richard, my guess is that you'll have a few more questions coming your way, but at least you can have a glass of wine while you answer those questions. But again, deeply grateful for your time this evening
No,
and
thank
all the
you,
work that you've done over the course of your career. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.